For as long as I can remember, I've been fascinated with Frederic Remington's artwork, his life story, and as was shared in the introduction, my interest grew when my brothers and I purchased the Remington place in 1983. I also might say that I wrote a history paper in high school on Frederic Remington, and then again at Kansas State University. I don't know if any of you took history from Homer Sokolowski at K-State, but I wrote a paper on Frederic Remington for that class, Kansas history class. But when I was a boy, my grandfather would tell me stories about Remington from time to time, and most of the stories he heard from his father and others in the community when he was growing up. My great-great-grandfather, Abraham Claassen, had a home across the street from the Hoyt store in Plum Grove, where Remington and his cronies would hang out when they were in town. Most everything written about Frederic Remington in Kansas can be traced back to the research done by Dr. Robert Taft and his association with Myra Lockwood Brown and Cora Mooney Bullock. The Harold and Peggy Samuels biography on Frederic Remington relies almost exclusively on the Taft and Brown and Bullock research and the first-person accounts that they gathered in the 1940s. Interestingly enough, Dr. Taft was a chemistry professor at KU, not a history professor. He had a keen interest in Western art and had planned on writing a biography on Remington before his death in 1955. He also wrote the book Artists and Illustrators of the Old West, published in 1953. Myra Lockwood Brown had a master's in English from Baker University and had been an English professor at McPherson College until she married a farmer from Rosalia, Kansas. She and Dr. Taft teamed up to write several articles about Remington in Kansas. Cora Mooney Bullock from El Dorado had an interest in local history. Her father was V.P. Mooney, author of the History of Butler County, which was published in 1916. He was also one of the early founders of the town of Towanda. I found in the last year that Dr. Taft's papers were housed in the Kansas State Historical Archives in Topeka. The catalog for the papers were listed online, and there were 7 boxes of files on Frederic Remington. And so I wanted to see if I could learn anything new from this collection. First, a short introduction to Frederic Remington. Remington was a prolific painter, sculptor, illustrator, and writer whose works chronicled life in the American West at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. Remington was sure he was witnessing the end of an era, so he set out to tell the story of the cowboy and the American Indian. Remington's imagery told of the vanishing West and is unequaled as fine art. Readers of the periodicals Harper's, Outing, and Collier's would be very familiar with his work as an illustrator and as a journalist. Remington resided most of his life in the East, but made frequent trips to the West and Mexico. He even traveled to Cuba and spent a short time as a war correspondent during the Spanish-American War. His only residence in the West was the time spent as a sheep rancher on the Prairie of northwest Butler County. Frederic Sackrider Remington was born on October 4, 1861 in Canton, New York. Remington was the only child born to Seth Pierre Remington and Clarissa or Clara Bascom Sackrider. His father, Colonel Seth Remington, was a journalist, newspaper publisher, and a Civil War colonel. Colonel Remington spent the first 4 years of young Frederick's life away at war. His father probably contributed to Frederick's interest in portraying military conquest and his interest in journalism. Remington spent most of his young life in Ogdensburg, New York, however, where his father was a newspaper publisher. Somehow, at the age of 17, Remington convinced his parents to try some formal art training, so he enrolled at the Yale School of Fine Arts in New Haven, Connecticut. He was the only male student in his class at the Yale Art School. In addition to his art studies, Fred was a member of the football team at Yale. Interesting to note, the captain of the football team was the famous Walter Camp. Walter Camp was a football player, coach, and sports writer known as the father of American football and a member of the College Football Hall of Fame. At the end of the football season and the fall semester in 1879, Frederic went home to Ogdensburg, New York for Christmas. Remington stayed with his father, who was dying from tuberculosis, until his death in February. Fred's formal schooling was over. After the death of his father, Remington and his mother, Clara, moved back to Canton, New York, to be near family. Fred's grandfather, Sackrider, found them a place to live, and Remington's Uncle Mart found him a good-paying job. Remington began courting Eva Cantine, a young woman from nearby Albany, New York, and Eva and Fred planned to marry. However, Eva's father would not allow it. Because of this snub, as well as Remington coming into his father's inheritance, his motivation for his move to the prairies of Kansas was complete. Fred hoped to make his fortune and prove himself worthy of Eva's hand in marriage. So young Frederic Remington set off to make his fortune. So before we get too far into this story of how Frederic Remington became a Kansas sheep rancher, I'd like to share this map to orient you to some important location in the story. Note that the town of Peabody is 29 miles as the crow flies to the west of our location today in southern Marion County. And the Remington and Camp ranches are 11 miles to the southeast of Peabody in northwest Butler County. The small village of Plum Grove figures prominently in this story and is located 2 miles southeast of the Remington Ranch. The town of Plum Grove no longer exists as a result of the railroad bypassing the town, but the Plum Grove School was still in use until 1955. It was popular for Easterners, and specifically young men with money looking for an investment opportunity, to travel to the western states and become gentlemen ranchers, either cattle or sheep ranching. Remington's foray into Kansas sheep ranching was influenced largely by the amount of money he inherited and by a friend and a classmate from Yale, Robert Camp. Fred's inheritance totaled nearly $10,000, which he came into on his 21st birthday. The preferred livestock venture at the time was to invest in cattle ranching. But Fred had been influenced by the writings of Theodore Roosevelt and others who were successful with the cattle business. But the problem was that the cattle business took significantly more money than sheep ranching, and the sheep business was booming. The first time Bob Camp appears in the Peabody newspaper is in July 22 of 1881. Bob Camp, who has been sick for a long time, has been confined to his bed for the past week. Camp would have been in the Yale graduating class of 1882, but dropped out in 1880 because of his health. There are two other young men who are mentioned in the newspaper articles and do appear to be Eastern associates and acquaintances of both Remington and Camp. The men are Forbes and Cecil Wickersham, brother of Lord Wickersham of Oxford, England. The name Forbes never is mentioned with the first name. I could never find a first name for Mr. Forbes. But March 30 of 1882, the Peabody Gazette Herald says Forbes and Camp's thoroughbred lamb are handsome little animals and doing well. Evidently, Camp had already entered the sheep business with other partners. Those who knew Bob Camp when he first came to the area said he was thin, sickly young man. He came to Kansas looking to have his health restored and take advantage of an opportunity as a stockman and a rancher. Camp's father was a well-known Milwaukee banker, H. Camp, president of the First National Bank of Milwaukee. The Camps also probably had connections to many of the early Peabody residents who were also from Wisconsin. The summer of 1882, Camp was elected president of the Peabody Blue Stockings baseball team, noted in the August 24, 1882 Peabody newspaper. Also on the team was another close friend of Frederic Remington, Jim Chapin. A Paul Wickersham is also listed on the team, but I don't have any idea if he's connected to the Cecil Wickersham that was mentioned earlier. The small camp purchased, or the small ranch Camp purchased, was 11 miles south of Peabody on the northwest quarter of Section 25 in Fairmount Township, Butler County. The August 17, 1882 Peabody newspaper says, Mears reports land seekers plenty now. Among the latest sales is one belonging to M. Bateman down on the Whitewater, sold to Robert Camp for $2,600. Soon he added another 160 acres to his ranch. I will also give some background on what was happening in the sheep business in the area. By 1883, Butler County was only second to Cowley County in sheep numbers in the state of Kansas, with 68,138 head reported. The December 28, 1882 Peabody newspaper lists the names of 27 sheepmen within 10 miles of Peabody and with a total of 13,830 sheep. The article also says that the smaller flocks are added up in the area. There's probably close to 16,000 sheep. I inspected the 1880 federal census for the 4 townships in northwest Butler County and noticed that a large number of the occupations were listed as sheep herder or herder. The Plum Grove and vicinity notes also in the Peabody newspaper of December 28 that has a paragraph stating that Mr. Camp, living on Section 25, Township 23, Range 3, has a farm of 160 acres with a good house, 2 large barns on it. He owns 900 sheep and thinks sheep raising is the boss business. So the stage was set for Easterner Frederic Remington, and he was soon to become Frederic Remington, Kansas rancher. With his friend Camp already in the Peabody area, who could make sure any land purchases were on the up and up, and who could also have banking connections, Remington was confident that this was a business deal that could not go wrong. The St. Lawrence Plain dealer, February 28, 1883, says that Frederic Remington, son of the late Colonel S.P. Remington, has resigned his government position in Albany and is now in Canton visiting his mother and other friends and making preparations to start for Dakota in a few days. The newspaper was mistaken. Fred was headed to Kansas, and he would be in Peabody 2 weeks later. One can only imagine what Remington expected when he stepped off the train in Peabody on March 15 of 1883, but was probably excited to ride out to the ranch. Robert Camp had made arrangements for him to purchase. Frederic had been west once before in 1881, shortly after his father had passed away, and young Fred took a 2-month trip to Montana Territory, which was little more than a vacation, really. Remington didn't take a sketchbook with him, but he mailed a sketch he did on wrapping paper to Harper's Weekly. The Harper's art director had never received anything like it, but was intrigued with the Montana postmark. The sketch was redrawn by a Harper's illustrator and became the first illustration attributed to Frederic Remington to be published. This photo, taken in Peabody in 1883, has Remington portrayed as the American cowboy. Fred probably had his photograph taken for posterity to show his transformation from Easterner to cowboy. This is often how he liked his persona to be recognized back east in promotional material for his art. The land camp had made arrangements for Frederic Remington to purchase from Johann and Maria Jansen was the southwest quarter of Section 25 in Fairmount Township in Butler County. He purchased this for $3,400. It was directly south of Camp's Ranch. Henry Creek ran its course to the north through Remington's ranch and entered the Whitewater 3 miles to the south. The western side of the ranch was unique in northwest Butler County for the steep bluff rising sharply in elevation from the Henry Creek bottoms. Remington's disappointment was immediate. The country had not yet greened up from winter. Everything was brown and dreary. The relatively flat, treeless prairie and the rather stark accommodations of a Kansas sheep ranch must have caused him to question his decision to spend his meager fortune on sheep ranching venture. It was nothing like what he had imagined, and besides that, the sheep smelled bad. According to Ed Duval, whose father Ike was the proprietor of the Grand Central Hotel, Fred's melancholy was beyond anything men there had seen. People feared he might do away with himself. Days came he hid in room 16 of the Peabody Hotel and would see no one but Jim Chapin. Mother Duval, wife of the proprietor, brooded over him like a mother and carried upstairs the food he liked. He thanked her, but he left it untouched. Rolla Joseph, as a young boy, lived a mile southeast of Plum Grove, recalled that when Remington first came, he had the blues awful bad. I think his father had just died, but us kids all liked him. He used to buy us candy. I was only 10 or 12, but I used to go to his place lots. There were several of us kids who used to go out there, and I've eaten lots of meals there. There were no hotels in Peabody called the Peabody Hotel or the Duval Hotel, but since the Duvals were the proprietors of the Grand, it may have been referred to as the Duval Hotel. So Ed Duval would have been around 18 years old and was the primary source for much of the information that Taft and Brown gathered about Remington's time in the Peabody area. Remington and his cronies had a regular bachelor's club in Peabody, where this is for sure is a matter of speculation. This group of young men included Jim Chapin or Chapman, Bill Kerr, Robert Kemp, Jack Smith, Al Mathiat, Chester Farney, and Charles Harriman. And the group was sometimes referred to as the Plum Grove Gang. Dr. Charles Siebel, a local doctor who mostly worked as a pharmacist, in 1917 newspaper article said that the men boarded at his mother's place on their trips into town. Quoting from the article, "My mother's place was a frame building where the Slaymaker restaurant now is. There was a wooden porch with a railing around it built over the sidewalk, and Camp and Remington and the other two used to go out on the porch in the summer evenings with their mandolin and guitar, and they would sing and make merry until the wee small hours." In the interviews Myra Lockwood Brown conducted, it was said Fred had a lip for liquor. He and his friends seemed out for a good time. The clubhouse in Peabody, in Ed Duvall's words, was for the deviltry. When Frederic Remington arrived, to quote Mr. Duvall again, he was a hot sister. But that was only when he first arrived. Forbes, he said, was always a hot sister, drinking heavily and not a gentleman. Remington, he says repeatedly, was always a gentleman. The closing date for the ranch purchase was April 2, and Fred seemed to be over his depression. Remington set about acquiring the stock and equipment needed to run his newly acquired livestock operation. On May 31, Remington purchased an additional 160 acres from Charles W. and Cyril Potwin for $1,250. Remington's investment in land totaled $4,650. He also had other expenses for livestock and improvements to the ranch. His entire investment in the Kansas sheep ranch was estimated to be $6,050. Remington wrote to his uncle Horace D. Sackrider on May 16 that his account at the Peabody Bank was within $100 of being overdrawn and had made a draft of $1,000 on the St. Lawrence Bank as his sheep sheds were going up. I want the money, have no delay, as I would not have my draft dishonored for the world. An interesting paragraph appears in the Peabody Gazette in June 14 of 1883. Mr. Samuel Dickerson, our great dealer in merino sheep, has, in company with his brother-in-law, Mr. Hamilton, bought a fine lot of land 5 miles north of Peabody on the Marion Road, and will make that his stock farm in the future. Among his late dealings, he has sold to Mr. Remington 500 head of merino ewes to be delivered September 1st. Now, the preferred breed of sheep in Kansas at the time was the merino. They were known for wool production, but questionable for mutton. The money was in wool production. A common remembrance of Remington's days in Kansas was that he was sketching or drawing continually. The sketches were of anything that he found of interest. It is a shame that most of these don't exist or don't seem to have survived. Remington did a drawing of the Peabody Library, but it disappeared. Dr. Taft inquired about the picture in the early 1940s, but it was nowhere to be found. It seems that the only works to have survived was Remington's personal Kansas sketchbook. The Kansas sketchbook is an important record of 1880 sheep ranching in Kansas and the hired hands and the farming in the area. I don't know if there are other sketches in the book, as I haven't personally seen the sketchbook. I've just seen pictures or images from the sketchbook, and I've collected a number of them over the years, and we'll take a closer look at those images from the sketchbook. The sketchbook gives the viewer a look at life on Camp and Remington's sheep ranch. Many of the Easterners who came west and purchased ranches with the idea of making their fortunes in the livestock business hired men to do the day-to-day labor for them. It was no different for Camp and Remington. Camp had 2 or 3 hired men or herders, including a cook. Young boys were hired to herd sheep, and labor was probably shared between ranches at shearing time. Lambing time would have been labor intensive, and Camp must have been willing to jump in, as he is portrayed here as boss of the Badger State. In 1942, in a Kansas City Star article, C.M. Clark recalled that Camp told him in the spring he had been working day and night with lambing ewes. Each morning, Camp would ride a mule to hunt weak lambs. He carried a gallon coal oil can of milk for the tiny creatures which were too weak to stand. If he found them in time and poured milk down their throats, the lambs usually were saved. This morning was raw, and the sharp wind was driving rain when camp started out. He found twin lambs so weak that they could not have lived, and camp saw that the lambs had to be wrapped in blankets and warmed as well as fed. He got one under each arm, the reins of the bridle in one hand, with his precious oil can of milk in the other, started back to the house to get the lambs wrapped and put back of the kitchen stove. But as he approached the barn, who should come walking forth but Frederic Remington, and carrying of all things an umbrella. One look at the umbrella was enough for the mule, and away he went. Camp holding a lamb under each arm, with an oil can of milk in one hand, and trying to stop the mule with the other. He said he nearly squeezed the life out of the poor lambs before he got the mule stopped and turned around and headed back to the house. Remington and the other ranch hands greeted camp from the doorway with a vivid description of how he looked on the runaway mule. This is a watercolor image called My Ranch. The locals called them crayon drawings, and young Rolla Joseph testified to the accuracy of the drawings. The one-story room on the north with a gabled roof, not a shed roof, was the kitchen where Remington prepared meals, including pancakes and beef steak, and for the ranch hands, the men were constantly coming in, and for the boys he had out there to ride his horses and watch whatever fun, such as wild steer riding, boxing, or just planning something that might be underway. The other room downstairs beside the kitchen would now be called a living room. I think Remington and his fellows often ate there. The half-story room upstairs was the sleeping quarters, and Billy Kerr stayed at the ranch most of the time, and that's probably where his room was. There were other guests. The doorway in the sketch, there's a man that appears standing, and that's on the east side. I'll see if I can I don't know if you can see a man standing in the doorway, but that's on the east side of the house. That doorway is still in the current house. On the screen is Remington's My Ranch compared to a photograph the Green family made a year later. According to what Clifford Lathrop told Myra Lockwood Brown, one of the last buildings to be razed was the barn, which held inside, not on the door as some reports have it, the sketch of a cowboy roping a steer, which Remington had done, that he had also cut in the sketch with a knife. That sketch was a neighborhood pride. The barn also served as sort of a gymnasium, as did the yard near it. Rolla Joseph again said, there used to be a lot of boxing on his ranch too. Remington and Jack Smith were both pretty good. Billy Kerr, Al Mathiad, and some fellows over at Peabody used to box too. It was a regular evening pastime. Mr. Joseph continued, on the shed-lined hills of the ranch, Remington kept his sheep. I've seen as many as 2,000 or 3,000 there at one time. My half-brother, George Garrison, used to work up on the camp ranch. One time he brought home a rough pencil sketch that Remington had done. It was on rusty brown paper and showed a cow and her calf with a wolf ready to attack. We liked it. That picture went all around Plum Grove, and everybody saw it. On this page, on the left, Remington portrays his right-hand man, Bill Kerr, who lived at the ranch and was responsible for the everyday work. This allowed Remington to be away for days and possibly even weeks at a time. On the right is Bob Camp's cook, Phip. While Camp hired a cook, Remington preferred to do the cooking for the men and boys who worked for him. This is a story recalled by Lucinda Clifford, daughter of Ingram Shriver, he was a neighbor rancher. She visited the Remington Ranch to share 2 loaves of freshly baked bread. And as she entered the house, Fred dumped a basket of unwashed, dirty potatoes into a pot on the stove. Lucinda was aghast that Fred would cook unwashed potatoes and asked, "Why don't you wash the potatoes before you cook them?" To which Remington replied, "Wash them? I should say not. I've tried them both ways, and unwashed tastes much better than washed. Have you ever tasted boiled unwashed potatoes?" And Lucinda agreed she had not. "Well, tell your mom to cook them that way, and you'll see. And besides, it takes time to wash them." This image I took off of a negative at Kansas State Historical Archives, and they were in the Taft collection. And this page documents the process of growing corn in the early 1880s and follows the corn crop throughout the season. The upper left sketch is titled Spring Planting and is a 3-horse hitch tilling or plowing the soil in preparation for planting. And this sketch is titled The 4-Horse Corn Planter. And it's interesting because there appears to be a second man sitting in the front of the driver. The accuracy and detail of these small images that's contained in these images is amazing. I'll show you that. You probably can't see it, but there's a man sitting there, and I had never heard of this before, but yeah, seed in the, well, for the sake of interest, here's a photo of a 2-row 1880s 2-person corn planter. So this sketch is titled Cultivating Corn. I wonder what the man doing the cultivating thought of Fred as he labored behind the cultivator and Fred sketched. An old engraving of a horse-drawn walking cultivator, and this is from a Victorian mechanical engineering book of the 1880s. So notice the similarities there also. This was in color. However, I don't have a color image of this. I only had the black and white image titled Corn Shucking. And if you look closely, Remington captures the ear of corn in midair above the wagon. Another page in the sketchbook is simply titled Feeding. And there are 5 separate images on this page showing the hired men doing the daily chores around the ranch. I cannot be positive, but the man portrayed in the pictures looks to be Billy Kerr. And the sketch on the left is Bill, followed by the hungry sheep as he carries the hay across the pen. On the right are 2 hired men carrying containers of grain to feed in the trough in the pen from a wagon with 2 horses hitched behind it. It's hard to see, but here again, you could maybe see the 2 men back there at the back. 2 other sketches, one colored in the lower left of the page, and the left on the screen here shows the hand pitching loose hay. There's a sheep shed in the background, and the smallest image in the center of the page is of a wagon with 2 horses hitched, maybe coming in from the cornfield. The other colored sketch on the lower right of the page is shown here. The herder or drover is at the well watering his horse. And the last page in the sketchbook has 2 rams fighting at the top, and the bottom half of the page has a herder with his pony and a dog watching the sheep in the valley below. These are the only sketches that we know survived from his time in Kansas. But in the late 1940s, when Robert Camp was interviewed in Milwaukee, he had a picture hanging on the wall that Frederic Remington had given to him. And I wonder whatever happened to that picture and where that is now. So it was mid-October when a memorable experience occurred for Frederic, one that he wrote about 4 years later in the article for Outing magazine in the May 1887 issue. It was entitled Coursing Rabbits on the Plains. This was the first featured article in a popular magazine of the day that Remington both authored and illustrated. Up to this point, he had only illustrated articles others had written. The Whitewater River, Plum Grove, and Hoyt's Store figure prominently in this story. Coursing jackrabbits was a unique sport where the participants were mounted on a horse with a long pole or stick. The rider would attempt to dispatch or touch the unfortunate rabbit with the lance. It must have required a great deal of skill from the rider, as well as a quick and nimble pony. This illustration portrays Remington as himself on his beloved Terracotta. The hound behind is called Daddy, and they're closing in on the jackrabbit. As the story is told, we learn that there are 7 mounted participants who plan a full day of chasing jackrabbits in the Plum Grove area. Robert Camp identified the participants shown in this illustration, with Frederic Remington riding Terracotta in the lead, followed by Bill Kerr riding Prince. James Chapin is next, and in the forefront is Bob Camp. The last of the group of 4 is Phip, Bob Kemp's cook, riding Bob, a mule, and he's lagging far behind in the background. Not included in the illustration is Charlie B., an Englishman, riding a blue mare, and John Smith, who are also mentioned in the story. Remington details how the sport is played and tells a tale of what young men did for sport on the prairies of Kansas. As the story unfolds, the 7 end up at a neighbor's ranch, old John Mitchner. He was new to the area. John asked the group to stay for dinner, and they accepted. While they were waiting for dinner to be cooked, the conversation turned to horses. After looking over John's horses, the group began to tease John about the condition of his horses. With this, John replied, "Well, my horse stock ain't nothing to brag on now, because I ain't got the money that you fellers down in the creek has, but to buy 'em with. But I've got a little mare down there in the corral that I've got a notion can run some shakes." So this was enough of an invitation the group needed for a horse race, and the wagering commenced. Jim put up Push Bob, and Bill Kerr joined in, and bet Prince could beat old John's mare and Push Bob. Dinner was abandoned, and John went to the corral for his horse. When they saw how old and decrepit the horse John was going to race, they could barely contain themselves with their good fortune. And among the others who wagered their horses, Remington also put up Terracotta. Remington agreed to fire the starting shot. Here are the words of Frederic Remington. The 3 racers came up to the scratch, Bill and Jim sitting their sleek steeds like centaurs. Old Prince and it had bristled up and moved up with great vim and power. Push Bob swerved about and stretched his neck on the bit. The boys were barefooted with their sleeves rolled up and a handkerchief tied around their heads. Old John came prancing out, stripped to the waist on his mare, which looked indeed more game when mounted than running loose in the corral. The old man's gray, thin locks were blowing loose in the wind, and he worked his horse up to the scratch in a very knowing way. We all regarded the race as a foregone conclusion and had really began to pity the old John's impoverishment. But still there was interest in the bout between Prince and Push Bob. This was the very first time the victors of the Whitewater Bottoms had met, and was altogether the greatest race which the country had seen in years. How the boys from the surrounding ranches would have gathered could they have known it, but it is just as well that they did not. For as I fired the gun and the horses scratched away from the mark, old John went to the front and stayed there till the end, winning by several lengths, while Prince and Push Bob ran what is called the dead heat, although there was considerable discussion over it for a long time afterwards. There was my dear little Terracotta gone to the hand of the spoilsman, and the very thought almost broke my heart, as I loved that mare as I shall never love another animal. I went back to the corral, sat down, and began to whittle a stick. It took Bob and Charlie a half an hour to walk the quarter mile back to the ranch. Bill and Jim said nothing and kept them from flying. Bill and Jim said nothing, kept them from flying the country to save their horses, but the fact that they had no saddles. The 6 men were left to look at old John's corral and his newly obtained herd of stock as he reminded them dinner was ready. But the story goes they had lost their desire for dinner and started their long walk home. Fip the mule was used to carry the saddles for the other 5 back home. The story of the horse race and wager made its way to the small village of Plum Grove before they did. The next evening, as they headed to Hoyt's store, as they approached, they could hear John telling the story and the sound of loud laughter coming through the window. The men could not face the humiliation and decided to turn around and head back home rather than face the Plum Grove citizenry. Hoyt's stone store in the small burg of Plum Grove seemed to be a regular gathering place for Remington and his buddies. Most groceries and supplies for the daily living could be purchased either at Hoyt's store or one of the other businesses in town without the need to make the long trek to Peabody. The store was a gathering place for the locals to shoot the breeze, compare and trade horses, and catch up on community news. Edwin Hoyt had been a partner in the store in Peabody for a year and a half before he opened this store in Plum Grove in early 1883. Several stories relate how Fred stood up for the underdog, and this is one. Hervey Hoyt was the young son of Edwin Hoyt, and he was picked on by the other boys in town. The accounts say that Hervey had a handicap or a speech impediment, and Fred bought candy for Hervey and had him throw it to the other boys as a way to even the score. This next story involving Fred and his buddies, took place in Plum Grove on Christmas Eve. It was quite a crowd that gathered for Christmas Eve program at the Stone Schoolhouse. The Coppins made the 5-mile journey for the event. The Nathan Duncan family, who lived just to the northeast of what would become the town of Potwin, came 3 miles. And little Rolla Joseph with his mother walked the mile to the north across the prairie for Christmas Eve festivities. The young men from the Remington and the camp ranches came horseback. Billy Kerr, Remington, Jack Smith, Chester Farney, and Charles Harriman. Remington was with the crowd that stopped at Hoyt's store and the blacksmith shop where liquor could be had in the back before heading over to the schoolhouse. Someone started flipping candy or paper wads at the bald head of Nathan Duncan. It seemed that Remington had the older Duncan had a grudge against each other, so Fred was blamed for instigating the candy throwing. It seemed funny, and the boys were surprised when Mr. Duncan demanded that the candy tossers come outside and face a whipping. The guilty were asked to leave the schoolhouse and retreated back across the road to Hoyt's. When the program ended, Santa Claus began to distribute
gifts to the children, when suddenly flames appeared in the window on the left nearest the front, and someone yelled, "Fire!" The panic and commotion was terrible, with the crowd surging toward the door, which opened to the inside. Children sitting in the deep stone windows opened them and jumped out. Ina Snorf, in the window nearest the fire, broke the glass of their hand, cutting them painfully. And Dr. Seaman realized that the fire posed no danger, jumped up on a chair to calm everyone. "Sit down, there's no danger," and got the panicked crowd under control. The boys, who were pretty drunk and feeling some humiliation from the rebuke at the school, had lit some Excelsior they brought from the store, and one of the boys yelled, "Fire," not thinking of what could happen. Charles Lobdell, who had grown up in Clifford Township and later became well known in Kansas politics and as a newspaper publisher, was serving as a justice of the peace in El Dorado Township when he received the complaint about the schoolhouse prank. The complaint was against 5 young men for disturbing a religious meeting, and a warrant was issued. Constable Corey served the warrant to the 5. The first trial was tried in Justice Charles Lobdell's court, and it ended in a hung jury. The second trial began on February 4, 1884, and was also tried in Lobdell's court. The trial in El Dorado lasted 2 days, and Remington was often referred to as Billy the Kid during the proceedings. But it was determined that Remington had been at Hoyt's store and was not at the schoolhouse at the time of the fire, and he was exonerated. This jury also disagreed, and it was split 6-6. However, the El Dorado Republican misnamed Remington as Fred Pennington in this short article on January 14 of 1884, and I'll quote the newspaper article. "Some of the youngsters up in Plum Grove on Christmas Eve at an entertainment in the schoolhouse behaved in a most unseemly manner, judging by report, and got up a row which assumed almost the proportions of a riot. It ends that the boys are a little wild and woolly occasionally in the Northwest." The case was dismissed following the payment of court costs and attorney fees and other expenses. Even though Remington had been exonerated, all fees were paid by Remington. By late December of 1883, Frederic had lost his interest in sheep ranching. He wrote to a friend back east that he planned to sell out and go somewhere else. It may have had something to do with the Christmas Eve prank, or that he simply didn't have his heart in sheep ranching, or it might have been that his sweetheart Eva Canteen was miles away. The sale of his sheep ranch to Daniel M. Green was finalized on February 15, 1884 for $5,500. The deed signed by Remington is on display at the Peabody Historical Museum. Quoting R.A. Scott, Remington concluded to quit ranching. He sold his land and advertised the sale of his stock and equipment. There were sheep, horses, and cattle. I took over the notes for them. At that time, he was flat broke. The livestock and equipment sold at auction sometime between late February and the end of May, when D.M. Green moved to the Remington Ranch. It was fortuitous that Remington sold out and quit the sheep business when he did, because the sheep market was in steep decline in 1884 and 85. The 1885 agricultural census shows that there are only 1,300 sheep left in Fairmount Township, and those sheep were all on the Camp and the Green ranches, which had formerly been Remington's place. Eventually, Camp transitioned his ranch over to focusing on the horse business. He sold a number of studs on the ranch as noted by ads, or he stood a number of studs on the ranch as noted by ads in the Peabody newspaper, And the famous trotter Joe Young was also under his care at times and grazed Camp's pastures in Fairmount Township. My great-grandfather, John Claassen, was the clerk at the Remington auction. He was a meticulous record keeper, and from his records we know that he was paid 16 cents for his services as a clerk. He also purchased this sugar bowl at the auction. Remington returned to Ogdensburg, New York with the money he had in hand from the sale of his stock and land, and claimed that he had made money on the venture out west. He renewed his proposal to Eva Canteen, and her father dropped his objection for his daughter to marry Frederic, partly because Eva had been so unhappy and missed Fred so badly. They were married on October 1 of 1884, and with his remaining funds and a loan he convinced his mother to give him, he and a partner invested in a hardware business and a saloon in Kansas City. These businesses were also unsuccessful and didn't last long before he was back in New York, determined to make a career of art. Remington returned to the Peabody at least 3 times after he sold and left the area. The Peabody newspaper on May 29, 1884, has a short note that says, "Fred Remington was down from Kansas City Monday, shaking hands with old friends. He purchased one of Frank Christ's home-manufactured buggies. Thus does Peabody compete with the great trade centers." Walla Joseph said that he was back again in June of 1885, but it was a short visit. The last time was in 1886 on his way east from his first southwestern trip, commissioned by Harper's Weekly. Ed Duval recalled that on this visit he came out to the Duval farm northwest of Peabody. When the Green family moved on to Remington's place, they said the walls of the sheds and barns were covered with Remington's drawings. One legend that has been part of local lore is that the first sketch of what became the Bronco Buster sculpture was done here or in this area. Where did the Bronco Buster sculpture idea originate? Grandam Scrivener worked for Bob Camp and Remington as a herder and a cowboy. And the Scrivener family lore is that the Bronco Buster bronze that Remington sculpted in 1895 was originated from sketches made of Grant Scrivener as he handled a bucking horse on the Camp Ranch. In fact, the Scrivener family had a drawing by Remington, but this may have been lost in the 1949 tornado that came through the area. Looking at this photograph, Grant certainly does resemble the cowboy mounted on the bronc. I assume Remington was working on his craft and his work was evolving in the time that he was here. There's not really a way to say with any certainty where the idea or the concept for the Bronco Buster came from. I'm sure he saw a number of horses buck in a country where life depended on the horse. Remington was a master of portraying the horse in action, and I have no doubt he had a photographic memory. This is just a small sample of work portraying the bucking horse or bucking bronco. The Bronco Buster was Remington's first sculpture, and the bronze was copyrighted in October of 1895. Most think that the Bronco Buster was adapted from this drawing, The Pitching Bronco, published in Harper's Weekly on April 30 of 1892, and that was 9 years after he left Kansas. Frederic Remington's house today, Peter Paulson purchased the ranch from the Green family, and the house was remodeled extensively by the Paulson family sometime between 1910 and 1920. None of the other buildings remain from Remington's time. In fact, they were all gone by the early part of the 20th century. I will end my presentation with this image entitled Texas Cattle in a Kansas Corn Corral from the April 28, 1888 Harper's Weekly. This was used on the front cover of the May 1948 Kansas Historical Quarterly. So I think with that, that pretty much ends my presentation.